And now, listeners, something different. Our dear friend and first fashion correspondent, Hannah Bourbon, sent us quite a captivating sound recording that gives us some insight and explanation as to her whereabouts and activities the past few years. She included a letter asking us to share it with you all and requested that we add some flair to give the ordeal a little more pizzazz. And so, from Green Valley Radio to you, comes Nazis in New York, a Hannah Bourbon story.
It was an ordinary spring day in 1942. The world was at war and everyone was caught in the middle of it. Each of us had a role to play, whether it was in the army, the factory, or the Victory Garden. For Hannah Bourbon, that role was as a fashion correspondent of great renown. Well regarded by anyone with any fashion sense, I lived my days in relative obscurity, sharing my fashion advice on the radio and in the newspaper of a small town, far from the troubles of the world. I awoke as I always did to the sound of the library clock tower's ring at 8 in the morning. I began my morning routine, which consisted of listening to the local news on the radio, eating toast with as much butter as the war rations would allow, and drinking a fresh glass of orange juice with a splash of corn liquor made by one of the local farmers. Then I got dressed and left my posh apartment to grab the morning paper at the newsstand outside. I walked through the lobby and nearly made it out the door when the doorman called my name.
Excuse me, Miss Bourbon. There's a telegram for you.
I broke from my morning routine long enough to grab the telegram and thank the doorman, but I was so focused on the day's newspaper, I merely placed the small piece of paper into my coat pocket and continued on my way to the newsstand down the street. With a fresh paper in hand, I stood beside the newsstand and flipped through the pages of war news and classifieds, just the usual stories, with the exception of some mysterious parachuters that went missing in upstate New York. After searching for what felt like ages, I finally found my column, The World of Fashion. I checked the page number, then I checked it a second time just to be sure. Finally, I exclaimed to myself, "The 5th page!" and rang up the Green Valley Sentinel to sort this all out.
Green Valley Sentinel, how may I direct you?
This is Hannah Bourbon.
Ah, yes. Good morning, Miss Bourbon. Mr. Denison is expecting your call.
Is he now? Well, put me through straight away. A man's voice came on the line.
Miss Bourbon, good morning.
Mr. Denison, I am sorry to trouble you, but I must ask, what am I doing on the 5th page of this morning's paper?
There's a considerable amount of war news coming from the Pacific Front. Certainly you realize a war takes precedence over fashion advice.
I do realize that, Mr. Denison. Do you realize that my readers often don't look past the 3rd page?
I can't help it if your readers aren't capable of facing the hard news before getting to your fluff pieces about, well, fluff pieces and the like. Your fashion column is a favorite by many, but right now it's low on the totem pole when it comes to this newspaper's priorities.
My readers are capable of anything. Don't you think something positive like fashion advice should be front and center during the war?
Frankly, Miss Bourbon, no, I don't. The fact is, nothing is normal anymore, and men don't want to read about fashion. They want to read about war.
Men are at war, Mr. Denison, and their wives are at home working, planting, raising children, and in need of healthy distraction from these turbulent times. Fashion is just as important as speculative war news.
I'll tell you what, Hannah. You get a fashion story worth the front page and I'll print it. But it's got to be juicier than the latest developments on seasonal colors.
I'll find a story bigger and juicier than a ribeye steak before rationing.
Good luck.
The phone call ended. I decided to take a walk in the park at the center of town to consider how I might acquire the juicy story I had promised. A light breeze cut the warmth of the sunshine, making the atmosphere a perfect 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 degrees Celsius if you're the metric type. It wasn't until I reached the fountain at the center of the park at the center of town when I finally took a moment to look at the telegram I'd received earlier. I pulled out the folded piece of paper and read what it contained. Would you like to interview Mrs. Roosevelt? Stop. Call Hyde Park, ask for the butler. Stop. I stood beside the fountain, flabbergasted. Here I was in need of a juicy story, and now I had one. And it was probably the juiciest fashion story anyone could ask for, too. An interview with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. I quickly returned to my apartment. There I poured a little more orange juice and a little more of that corn liquor and dialed the operator and asked to be connected to Hyde Park.
Where in Hyde Park, New York, would you like to be connected?
I mean the Roosevelt home in Hyde Park.
Oh, I must tell you they probably will not accept your call.
They are expecting my call, actually. Or at least the butler is. Regardless, please connect me to the Roosevelts in Hyde Park.
Of course. One moment, please.
Naturally, one moment became two, which then became three, and by the time a voice came to the line, many moments had passed.
You have reached the operating station at Hyde Park. Please state your business with the President and First Lady.
I am Hannah Bourbon, fashion correspondent, and I was sent a telegram to call and asked to speak with the butler.
You mean Charles?
I don't know his name.
Right. I will put you through.
Once again, I was placed on hold until a man's voice came to the line.
This is the butler.
Ah, yes. I am Hannah Bourbon. The operator said your name is Charles?
Yes.
I assume you're the butler at Hyde Park?
It's what people call me. Except our operator, apparently. I should really chat with her about that.
Right. Well, you sent me a telegram asking me if I would like to interview the First Lady, and the answer is absolutely yes.
Indeed I did, Miss Bourbon. Thank you for getting in touch so quickly. The First Lady's schedule is quite complex, as I am sure yours is.
I glanced at my calendar hanging on the wall, and each of its days was admittedly empty. As you say, Charles, I am naturally quite busy, but I'm sure I can move things around and be there as soon as you can get me there.
Splendid. I will arrange a rail pass for you on all the express lines, and meet you personally at the station.
Charles and I parted ways on the phone, and my plans were set. Before leaving the kitchen to pack my bags for a trip to Hyde Park, I called the Green Valley Sentinel and asked to be connected to Mr. Denison.
Green Valley Sentinel, this is Mr. Denison.
I have your juicy story, Mr. Denison. After gloating to Mr. Denison for a few minutes, I thoroughly packed the many possible ensembles rushing through my head that I could wear for the First Lady. Then I rushed to the train depot. From there, I traveled over halfway across the continent by express train, spending most of that time flirting with the army boys headed for war. After reaching New York City, with time to eat a fresh bagel, I transferred to a commuter train which took me northward along the Hudson River. Commuter trains did not generally have lounge cars with alcohol available, but before boarding, I noticed a private observation car attached to the rear of the train. I found my assigned seat somewhere in the middle of the train and thought of what sort of drink I might order. Once the train began moving out of the station, I made my way to the back of the train in search of the bar in that private car. I approached the vestibule that led into the car. Through the vestibule window, I saw a state-of-the-art rail car with wraparound seating and a cocktail bar in one corner. I entered the car and attempted to approach the bar, but was stopped by a conductor waiting on the other side.
Miss, this is a private car. I must ask you to return to your assigned seat.
I apologize, sir. I was merely looking for a drink. It was then that I noticed a handful of men in well-fitted suits sitting around the car. I heard one of them say, in quite a thick New York accent,
"Hey, she seems like a nice girl. Let her stay."
The conductor loosened up and made room for me to walk by. But with the attitude from those fellas, I decided to wait for a drink with the First Lady. I returned to my seat and took in the views of the Hudson River before finally arriving at the train station in Hyde Park, New York. Waiting outside the station was a limousine, and an elegant Packard. I naturally assumed the limousine was here to pick me up, seeing that this was a visitant to the president's house. But as I stepped closer to it, those men in the private car approached and began getting in. The Brash man from earlier noticed me walking towards their limo and remarked,
Hey, are you headed to the Roosevelts too?
"Sure am."
And what business do you have with the president?
"Oh, I'm meeting with the First Lady. About fashion."
Ah, I see. Important stuff, fashion.
"It is. What is it you have to see the president about?"
Can't talk about it.
"Confidential, eh? Well, that's fine. Just know that I'm the curious type, and I'll keep digging."
Then maybe I shouldn't invite you to join us on our ride up to the estate. I promise I'm not as brash as I came off on the train.
The Packard in front of the limousine honked, and a man called out from the open window,
Miss Bourbon.
and I realized the Packard was waiting for me. I turned back to the Brash man. "Thank you, but I believe this is my ride here. I suppose I'll see you up there." I left the Brash man as he entered the limousine, and I entered the Packard, sitting alongside Charles in the front seat. "Are you Charles?"
Sure am. Welcome to Hyde Park. Oh, and how was your train ride?
"Oh, it was just lovely. Who doesn't like the train?"
I actually don't care for the train. I much prefer flying.
"Flying? I didn't realize there were any butlers with a budding interest in flying."
I never said I was a butler.
"Charles, I noticed the limousine that was parked behind you is now following us. Who are those men?"
Oh, very observant, Miss Bourbon, but I couldn't say. Probably some men meeting with the president.
A sufficient answer, but certainly uninformative.
Ah, here we are. Welcome to the Hyde Park estate. All right, wait here while I check with the security inside.
No problem. I sat tight for as long as I could, but then that limousine arrived. I watched intently as its men exited the limo and were welcomed into the estate. Then, with inherent curiosity running through my veins, I left the Packard and approached the limo driver as he took a smoke break. "Excuse me, driver man."
Yes? What is it?
Who were those men?
I don't know. I'm just a limo driver. Who are you?
My name is...
Hannah Bourbon.
Yes? It was Charles. He waved me forward and led me into the estate's entryway.
I thought I'd asked you to stay in the car.
You did, but I have a terrible habit of doing what I want when I want.
Is that right? Well, please try and set your habits aside while speaking with the First Lady.
No promises, Charles.
Truly, I don't know why she asked for you, a small-town fashion columnist, instead of one of the more sophisticated fashion writers out there like Mary Hampton.
Mary Hampton gave me my start in fashion, you know.
Did she? Well, regardless of my own thoughts, the First Lady has asked for you and is ready to see you in the South Parlor. Come with me.
I followed in anticipation to meet one of the country's most influential figures. Yet to my right, I couldn't help but notice those men in well-fitted suits stepping into another room to meet with the president. I even heard him say from afar, "Ah, if it isn't the boys from Manhattan," as the doors shut. And before I knew it, I was approaching Eleanor Roosevelt in her own place of work.
Mrs. Roosevelt, this is Hannah Bourbon, the fashion correspondent you requested.
Welcome, Miss Bourbon. You need no introduction here. I recognized you the moment the door opened. The way you wear collar and accessories is distinct.
Why, thank you. It is beyond a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Roosevelt.
Charles, leave us to our Koki coffee.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, what was that you just said?
Koki coffee? Would you like a cup? It comes from the Crown Princess Marta of Norway.
I don't know what that is, but I would love a cup. She then invited me to take a seat across from her as she poured 2 cups of hot, dark liquid. We both clinked our little porcelain cups and took a sip when I exclaimed, "Oh, it's just coffee. I would have figured people from Norway drank tea."
Indeed, it is coffee, Miss Bourbon. Many don't realize that Norwegians love their coffee more than they love their tea. Was the trip here comfortable?
Yes, it was, thank you. I must say the telegram inviting me here was quite a surprise. As Charles told me outside, I am just a small-town columnist. Surely someone with a larger audience, perhaps Mary Hampton's column in California, would be more appropriate.
That is exactly right. And that is exactly wrong.
Come again?
Don't get me wrong. Mary Hampton is a fine fashion columnist and a dear friend. But the story I have in mind is not meant for the big cities. The interview I have in mind is for the small towns of America.
I see. I suppose my first question is to ask, then. What is it that small-town America needs to hear?
Well, you see, last week I had a lively conversation at a luncheon with the fashion group of New York City. Then you know they are the leading group people look to for fashion in this country. The fashion group includes editors, writers, advertisers, as well as designers, producers, and artists. I'm sure you are familiar with them.
I'm too eccentric to be invited to their gatherings, but yes, I am familiar.
They are an interesting audience to converse with, because the faces before you reflect the thinking which is going on in the various people's minds across the nation in these times of war. I believe you share the sentiment that fashion is a valuable part of the social fabric of our country these days.
Indeed I do. I was just telling the editor of my paper something along those lines.
Yes, well, it is true that the conventional newspaper reader may not be interested in fashion. But I've something to say to the ladies reading the paper, and you know as well as I that women read the papers more than the men would like to believe.
And no doubt they've had to struggle these past few years maintaining a normal, fashionable lifestyle.
Absolutely. The rations on colors, fabrics, and styles have an effect on this country's morale. I believe we are at a time to redefine and broaden the definition of the word fashion.
Do go on, Mrs. Roosevelt.
Fashions include not clothes and shoes and cosmetics alone. These are essentials to turning out a well-groomed person. Fashions also include the things that go into a design for a living, such as home furnishings, draperies, rugs, art, anything which has to do with beauty and comfort and the arrangement of a home. This is the perspective I want to share with America.
I completely agree with this sentiment, and think this message will be well received in Green Valley and many other towns in the country.
I'm sure it will. We are all looking for things to get us through this gnarly war.
It was just then I noticed the most peculiar thing outside the window. It appeared to be the limousine driver running for his life into the woods behind Hyde Park. Mrs. Roosevelt, is there any reason a man would be running into your woods?
No, that would be quite out of the ordinary. Did you see a man running into the woods?
I believe so, ma'am.
Charles, come in here a moment.
Yes, ma'am? What can I do for you?
Hannah here just saw a man running into our woods. Could you send the Secret Service to look into it?
Yes, I'll do so right away. Ed and Miss Bourbon, I believe your return train will be arriving in a short while.
How the time flies. Well, Miss Bourbon, as much as I'd like to continue this lively chat, I must attend to the rest of the day's agenda.
Of course. And I assure you, Mrs. Roosevelt, I will spread your message on fashion to every home in Green Valley.
I'm sure you will. Safe travels home, Miss Bourbon.
Charles escorted me back to the entrance of the estate, where I explained to him in more detail what I had seen, and why I was somewhat certain that the man running into the woods was the limo driver.
See? The limo driver's right here.
I see a limo driver, but that is a different man.
Perhaps it is. But we do use a service that caters to important men, like the ones meeting with the president. It's possible that there was a changing of the guard, as it were. Or Whatever limo drivers would call that.
Perhaps you're right. But I am also right in what I saw.
And we have the Secret Service looking into it as we speak. Now, let's get you back to that station,
I realized there may be some decent alcohol in that limo, and figured, why not try for a ride with them? Hold on, I said to Charles. Maybe I can get a ride with those Manhattan boys. I called out, "Excuse me, boys? You've still got room in that limo for me?"
Yeah, sure do.
Said the brash man from Manhattan.
Hop on in.
But then the limousine driver, that is to say, the new and unfamiliar limousine driver, interrupted and said,
"I am sorry, there is no room,"
with quite a noticeable German accent. The Manhattan man looked puzzled, shrugged, and then said,
"See you on the train, miss."
Then he joined his colleagues in the limo. How odd, I said to myself.
What's up?
Oh, just that there was no issue with me joining them earlier. Also, that limo driver is absolutely a different man.
As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really make any difference at all. Now let's get you back to the train station.
And so, we climbed into the Packard. Charles started the car and began driving me back to the train station. The limo wasn't far behind and continued to stay in my mind. Looks like those limo boys will be on my return trip. You really don't know who they are? You called them important men before.
Anyone that meets with the president is important, Miss Bourbon.
Well, how many of Roosevelt's important men travel here via private rail car?
I suppose not many. You are quite observant of things.
That's what sets me apart from the rest of the fashion columnists. I notice everything. But it is impossible to not notice the importance of those men in that limo. Any idea what they're up to?
I'm not on the up and up with that business. And you really shouldn't be asking so many questions.
Oh, you must have heard something, Charles.
I hear lots of things, Miss Bourbon.
Then what is the scuttlebutt on those men?
All I've heard is that whatever they're working on is going to change the war.
Interesting.
Yes, well, we're back at the station. It's been a pleasure, Miss Bourbon. Perhaps we can arrange a similar interview with the First Lady someday in the future.
Sounds grand, Charles. And then I noticed something peculiar. Hang on a moment.
What is it, Miss Bourbon?
That limousine isn't here. Don't you find that odd?
They're risking running late for the train, but I wouldn't call it explicitly odd. In fact, the train will probably wait for them. Perhaps the driver just needed to stop for gas.
It's not exactly a long drive from the estate to the station. Where could they have even gone?
You better get going.
Right. I stepped out of Charles's car and approached the train depot. Drops of rain fell gently when I realized the private car, and more importantly, its cocktail bar, was currently unoccupied. I boarded the train and turned right instead of left, heading for the back. I entered the empty private car, explored its cocktail bar, poured myself a drink, rye whiskey and soda, if you're wondering, and enjoyed a moment of solitude in the empty and slightly extravagant private rail car. But that moment of solitude ended abruptly when the conductor walked through the door.
"What are you doing here?"
Asked the conductor.
"I kicked you out of here on the afternoon train."
"Those boys from earlier invited me here. Is that why the train is delayed?"
"Yes, but we'll be moving along soon. Perhaps even sooner if you return to your seat."
"Fine."
"And leave the drink?"
"I'll leave the glass, but I'm taking the drink." There. Happy now?
"Obviously not. Go find your seat."
I found my assigned seat for the return train to Manhattan. The rain pattered on the passenger car window and obscured my view, but I was able to just make out the shape of the limousine arriving near the station, some 20 minutes late. I saw the figures of 6 men leave the limo and head for the private car at the rear of the train. This was odd to me, as the number of men that met with the president earlier that day was 5. I considered if an additional colleague had joined them, and perhaps that was why the limo went in a different direction. Or it could be as simple as that limousine driver escorting them to their private car through the rain. Although I did not see an umbrella, and that is fairly customary when escorting someone through the rain. As I pondered all of this, the train jolted forward and began making its way back towards Manhattan. After a few minutes of idle rail travel, and when I was sure the conductor would be at the other end of the train, I stood from my seat and made my way back to that private car. I assumed that the brash man from Manhattan would be fine with my return to their private car, and there I could learn who this mysterious 6th person was. Something felt off, though, as I crossed through the vestibule and entered the private car. I saw men huddled around the cocktail bar, looking through a briefcase. A few were skimming through various papers from inside. But these men were not the ones from earlier, and the brash man from Manhattan was not in this private car. The limo driver, though, the one with the German accent, who said there was no room in the limousine, he was. I felt very uneasy, and was prepared to return to my seat, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I remained longer, in an attempt to eavesdrop on their conversation. But I could not understand a word they said. Not because they were speaking too quietly, or because of a hearing impairment. I have quite impeccable hearing, actually. But because they were speaking fluent German, a language which, at that time, I knew nothing about. And then, it all clicked. The first limo driver running for his life, the second limo driver having a thick German accent, the limo driving, of course, probably to dispose of the boys from Manhattan and put in their place these Germans, and now seeing these men excitedly going through that briefcase. There was no doubt in my mind that these men were Nazis, and that briefcase held important papers. As I began to leave the private car and return to my seat, I accidentally turned in a way to make the heel of my shoe squeak on the floor. The men at the bar turned, and then the leader of the pack, the limo driver man, scowled at me.
This is a private car. Get out.
And so I did, but not without beginning to think of a plan. By the time I reached my seat, I had it all sorted. All I needed to do now was wait. The train stopped in Tarrytown, a suburb north of the city. The conductor walked through each of the cars, informing us that the locomotive was filling up on water, and this would be a good moment to step off and stretch our legs. I saw the Nazi men step off the train for a smoke, and made my move. I snuck back into the private car to investigate that briefcase. It sat on the cocktail bar. I opened it and had enough time to see these were top-secret documents meant for very specific people. But just as I began skimming the introduction, I heard the German men returning to the car. I had no time to run, and so I closed the briefcase and hid, kneeling down behind the bar. The train started moving again, and I started to think of a way out of that private car unseen, and ideally with that briefcase in hand. But it didn't take long for one of those Germans to step behind the bar. And of course, it was the intimidating leader of the bunch.
Oh, it's you again,
said the German man. He seemed almost unsurprised to see me. It's me again, I replied.
Who are you?
I stood up and answered, "I am Hannah Bourbon, fashion correspondent. Who are you?"
Hans.
"Nice to meet you, Hans. Well, I was just looking for a drink, and now I'd better be going."
What are you doing in here? Why do you keep coming back? We clearly want to be left alone.
Like I said, I was looking for a drink.
You found it. Now leave before I call the conductor.
Thing is, while I was looking for a drink, I also found top-secret files in that briefcase over there. And, not to sound presumptive, but based on your accent and fluent German, I would take a shot in the dark that those papers don't belong to you. The jig is up, Hans. I can see quite clearly you're all up to something nefarious.
If we are up to something nefarious, then you should consider what we would do to ensure those files get to wherever we are expected to take them. I suggest you leave.
I took a few steps around Hans and placed myself between him and the exit to the rest of the train. I'm not leaving until you tell me what you're up to.
Quite brave for a fashion lady. Even if you knew what we are up to, you couldn't stop us.
Hans then brandished a gun and yelled,
"Get out of here!"
"Fine," I yelled back. "If we're going to start pointing guns at people, I will leave. But make no mistake, Hans, I can stop you. I can stop all of you." I pointed at each of those men when I said, "all of you," by the way, and it was quite intimidating if I do say so myself. Now, in a moment like this, when I am forced to think on my feet, I am known to do things a little hastily. Despite the drawbacks of indulging my impatience, I find that doing so often leads to the element of surprise. Just like at this moment, when I exited the private car, entered the next car, found an emergency brake cord outside a lavatory, pulled the cord, and brought the train to a screeching halt somewhere along the east bank of the Hudson River. The sudden stop in motion threw me to the floor, and surely gave those Nazis a startle. The conductor was nearby and saw me on the floor. He approached me with a look of concern.
"Are you all right?"
He asked.
"Here, let me help you up."
No, I'm fine, thank you," I replied, standing on my own.
"Oh, it's you, the troublesome passenger,"
he replied, realizing it was me, the troublesome passenger.
"Someone pulled one of the emergency brakes. It wasn't you, was it?"
"How dare you? What a thing to accuse a humble fashion correspondent of."
"I found you next to an emergency brake."
"I was in the lavatory, sir, and fell through that flimsy door when the train jolted to a stop. If you ask me, your doors require better securing for moments just like this."
"Well, it's wartime, and to pull an emergency brake on a commuter train is very peculiar. We are asking all passengers to step off the train until we determine who pulled it. There are reports of foul play afoot around Hyde Park, and for all we know, it's followed us on board. Please, follow me."
"Oh, goodness. Well, I completely understand. But, I need to gather my things in the lavatory. I know the way and am right behind you, Mr. Conductor." The conductor then went into the private car and escorted the Nazis in disguise outside, along with the rest of the train's passengers, giving me a chance to safely re-enter the private car unseen. I was pleased, though a little surprised, to see the Nazis had left the briefcase. Perhaps they didn't want it searched outside the train. I knew I couldn't just take the briefcase. They'd noticed that it was gone the moment they stepped back on board. So instead, I took the papers inside and stuffed them into my large and fashionable handbag. I then departed the private car and joined the rest of the passengers as the conductor ascertained who had pulled the emergency cord. Except, I noticed most of the passengers had returned to the train. After a few moments, the ones who remained were also sent back on board. Then, the conductor approached me.
Well, Miss Bourbon, my troublesome passenger, I've sent everyone but you back on board. Do you know why?
You wanted a one-on-one conversation, just the two of us?
I deduced you were the only possible person who could have pulled the cord. Do you have anything to say for yourself?
Isn't there an amendment about this sort of thing?
Please, just make this easy for all of us. The paperwork for this sort of thing is atrocious. Did you or did you not stop this train?
I may have, yes, but I had good reason.
What possible reason, outside of a real emergency, would there be to pull on an emergency cord?
If I told you I stopped the train because the men in that private car are Nazis in disguise and are attempting to leave the country with top-secret documents that don't belong to them, would you believe me?
Absolutely not.
Well, then, I've got nothing else to say for myself.
In that case, you are under arrest.
What? You can't place me under arrest.
No, but I can confine you to the baggage car, and the station police at Penn Station can sort this out.
Here, look. Here are the top-secret documents I took from them. I showed him the documents, and he looked very briefly at them.
To the looks of it, you're the one transporting important top-secret documents. I'll take those, and you can take a seat on whatever luggage trunk you desire in the baggage car.
I was dismayed to find I was being arrested, but relieved to be on the opposite side of the train, locked away from those Nazis in disguise. Best of all, even if they got to me, those top-secret documents were in better hands than Nazis. As far as I was concerned, my little plan was a success. We reached New York, and I was escorted by station police to the station police office. Along the way, I passed by Hans and his Nazi friends, and let me tell you, his face said everything. He knew I took those top-secret plans, and he couldn't do a thing about it, because I was being escorted by armed station police in the nation's busiest train station. I smiled at him as a sea of people intermingled between us, and we drifted apart. Little did I know I'd see him again, but that's a story for another time. My victorious smile vanished when I was placed in a confining room that lacked any color or atmospheric lighting. I was left alone for what felt like hours, until finally, a knock at the door. It was Charles.
You've got yourself in quite a pickle, Miss Bourbon.
I know, and I hate pickles. Charles, I am a bit surprised to see you. Don't you have butlering to do at Hyde Park?
I never said I was a butler.
Right.
How did you get these?
I took them from the men on the train.
Those men tied up real federal officials and left them in the woods. We presume they were Nazis who parachuted down to rendezvous with those men from Manhattan.
There is no need to presume. They were absolutely Nazis. They practically told me so themselves back on the train. I told you something was amiss with that runaway limousine driver.
It's a good thing that you did. That's what led the Secret Service to find the rest of those Manhattan boys a little while later.
But what happened to the Nazis?
I'm afraid they got away, but empty-handed, which in this case is far more important than apprehending a few Nazi spies.
How do you mean?
You secured the files they were here to get, Miss Bourbon. Did you not read the files when you had the opportunity?
Just enough to see they were top secret. I'm not a speed reader like my old pal Johnny.
Well, I don't know who Johnny is, but it's a good thing you didn't read these files.
Why is that?
Nothing. Probably be sent to a government town in New Mexico.
Oh. Well, that sounds dreadful.
Depends on whether or not you enjoy the desert. That conductor who apprehended you made the decision to read the files on the rest of the journey and, well, let's just say it's a good thing he likes the dry climate. But you didn't read these files, right?
Nope.
Well, then in that case, Miss Bourbon, we would like to interview you for a job.
A job?
Yes, a job.
What sort of job?
A job that hasn't existed before.
And who is we?
We are an organization called the Office of Strategic Services.
That sounds quite boring.
It is anything but.
What does the job entail?
It's a twofold position. Traveling the world and helping defeat the Axis powers.
Oh, well that's not boring at all.
Well, what do you say?
I say fine. I'll interview for this job of yours, but on 2 conditions. First, we don't do the interview here. Job interviews should never be held in colorless rooms. Second, I would like a drink alongside my interview. What do you say to that?
I say that those are very reasonable conditions.
Then I say done deal. And so we left. But as we approached the exit of Penn Station, Charles then veered right and began walking towards the train platforms. Excuse me, Charles, I asked.
Yes?
Where are we going?
To get your drink. That was a condition, right?
Yes, but where? We're headed for the platforms.
Your drink is waiting for you in Washington, D.C.
From here, the story gets quite droll. Discussions of employment, training, compensation, and the usual what-with-all that comes with starting a new career. Not to mention, the work I'm doing inhibits me from discussing my assignments in detail. But rest assured, listeners, Hannah Bourbon is alive and well, and may have more stories to share in the future. Until then, this is Hannah Bourbon saying so long, and here's to the future.
Thank you for listening to Nazis in New York, a Hannah Bourbon story. Starring Hannah Marks as Hannah Bourbon, Chris Joazard III as Charles, Alice Scavarda as Eleanor Roosevelt, Danny Havoc Garcia as Hans, and Xandre Bartholo as the Conductor. With Grayson Stone as Brash Manhattan Man, Liz Dye as Green Valley Sentinel Operator, Olivia McNally as Green Valley Operator, Trinity Medellin as Hyde Park Operator, Mark Thayer as Mr. Denison, and Cody Livinash as the Limo Driver. With additional voice work from Riley Brent, Brian Connolly, and Nick Sider. Music used in this story is sourced from Guild Light Music, a collection of historical forgotten musical recordings from the early 20th century, remastered masterfully by Guild Music. Sounds used in this story come from Freesound, all licensed under Creative Commons, and Cider Sounds, our in-house collection of sound recordings. This story was written and produced by Nick Sider. All characters and voice dialogue are owned by Sider & Company. Thanks for listening.